This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the UK has liked to think of itself as one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters. Now, a new survey published by More in Common, comparing attitudes from the UK, France, Germany and Poland, suggests that Brits are the most pro-Ukraine population in Western Europe, and about equally as pro-Ukraine as the Poles. Even more interestingly is that Ukraine isn't as polarising in the UK. Brits are more united on Ukraine regardless of which party they vote for, compared to other populations across Europe. So in this video, we'll take a look at the survey data and try to explain why the UK is so pro-Ukraine. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Let's start with the recent More in Common survey. A majority of Brits across every age category and voter group, unlike in other countries, think it's overall important for the UK that Ukraine defends its sovereignty against Russia. Overall, 79% of Brits say Ukraine's defence is important to the UK, higher than the 68% of Germans, 70% of French people, and 71% of Americans, who believe Ukraine's defence is important to their respective countries. Only Poland, which shares a border with Ukraine, is higher, at 87%. Similarly, Brits are also more likely to want Ukraine to regain the territory lost to Russia since at least the 2022 invasion. A higher share of UK respondents, so 66%, think their country should continue supporting Ukraine until Russia is pushed back to at least its pre-2022 borders, while 54% of Germans, 57% of French respondents, and 56% of Americans think the same. Similarly, only 13% of Brits think the UK should stop supporting Ukraine now, while 3 in 10 Germans think Germany should. When it comes to cross-party support, Brits are more united in their belief that Russia is responsible for the war. Conservative voters are the most likely to hold Russia responsible, at around 84%, but the gap between Conservative and Labour voters is only 7 points, and the gap between Conservatives and Reform voters, who are the least likely to hold Russia responsible, is only 16 points, smaller than in other countries. The gap between Democrats and Republicans, for instance, is 24 points, while the gap between Germany's Greens and the AfD is 60. Similarly, looking at the net importance of Ukraine's defence by political party, again, Reform voters are closer to the mainstream view than other right-wing populist parties. Reform voters are 55 points more likely to see it as important than unimportant, while this is 41 among voters for France's right-wing populist National Rally, and 40 for US Republicans. What stands out even more is that voters for Germany's anti-establishment AfD party are the only group surveyed who are more likely to say it's overall unimportant for Germany that Ukraine defends itself against Russia, with a net score of -12. There are also other indications that Ukraine is a less polarising issue in the UK than in other European countries. For instance, on whether Russia is an enemy and whether Zelensky is a dictator. However, on other Ukraine-adjacent questions, Brits do diverge by party. Reform voters show a net negative approval of Starmer's handling of the conflict, and on the question of Starmer's EU-US Balancing Act, nearly half of Reform voters say Starmer is too close to Europe, while nearly half of Conservative voters and 60% of Labour voters say he's getting the balance right. Now, understanding why Brits are more supportive of Ukraine than their Western European counterparts, and especially why there's more cross-party unity on Ukraine in the UK, is more complex. We do have a few ideas, but we'd love to hear any thoughts you have in the comments if you've got them. Firstly, there's the moral leadership argument. This is the idea that, unlike other countries, including the US, the UK operates a foreign policy stance based on values rather than interests, following traditional narratives about protecting the liberal order and making the world a better place. Some of this also ties in with the UK's desire to project power abroad, arguably a legacy of the British Empire. But in terms of support for Ukraine, it's a symptom of the fact that Russia has been an enemy of the UK since the Cold War. There's been numerous diplomatic clashes in recent decades, notably over the poisoning of Russian dissident and Putin critic Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, and the 2018 Salisbury poisonings, which showed the UK public that Russia is willing to carry out targeted assassinations on UK soil. As such, the UK's sympathy for Ukraine is likely driven by this moral designation of Russia as the enemy, allowing the UK to claim the moral high ground by supporting Ukraine. This idea also seems to have gained traction since Trump's return as US president and his pro-Putin pivot. 17% of Brits now cite the war in Ukraine as a top 3 issue, compared to just 7% in early February. And in the last month, the share of Brits prioritising Ukraine as a top issue has more than doubled across all voter groups. The UK also now appears to be the only signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, intended to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, that hasn't breached it, as Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, and the US's Ukraine minerals deal is ostensibly a form of economic coercion, prohibited under Clause 3 of the memorandum. This in itself further supports the idea of the UK's moral leadership. Second is the fact that there's less at stake for the UK in criticising Russia, whereas other European countries have more to lose by provoking Putin. The UK, unlike other European countries, isn't dependent on Russian gas, with around half of the UK's annual gas supply coming through domestic production and the majority of imports coming from suppliers like Norway. Germany, on the other hand, was vastly dependent on Russian energy imports, although it has since substantially decreased its energy dependence on Russia, and France has actually continued importing Russian gas under a long-term agreement with Russia, with only Slovakia paying more to Russia for fossil fuels than France in November 2024. Poland, meanwhile, has arguably been Ukraine's most active and outspoken ally in Europe, and in the survey mentioned, Poles give Ukraine's defence a higher level of importance than Brits do. However, in Poland's case, this is driven less by apparent moral concerns and more by the immediate threat posed by Russia, in that Poland is geographically closest to Russia out of the countries surveyed, and could potentially be targeted with Russian air attacks in a wider war. Thirdly is the strategic fact that the UK has historically played a role in countering rising powers in Europe to maintain the balance of power on the continent, whether France during the Napoleonic Wars, Germany during World War II, or the Soviet Union in the late 20th century. So the UK's support for a weaker power, Ukraine, against a stronger, more threatening one, Russia, does follow historical precedent. British people ordinarily don't think about Ukraine in this way, but there is a cultural stereotype of Brits wanting to support the underdog, which is essentially what we're describing here. At TLDR News, we're always trying to help you learn more about the world around you. Luckily for us, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, shares this same commitment, with thousands of lessons in maths, science, programming, and AI. And not only that, their interactive lessons teach you by doing, instead of just asking you to mindlessly memorize stuff. This helps you build your critical thinking skills and become a better thinker. For instance, Brilliant's newly updated maths courses help you establish a strong foundation in algebra. It then helps you build on this, teaching you how to conquer calculus, all while maintaining an emphasis on problem solving and reasoning. The thing I like best about this, though, is that their mathematical courses help you develop your mathematical intuition and fluency, skills that you can use in the real world. As we've told you before, data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.